Make today. She was going to talk about some of the Burma campaign, but courtesy of George Gelder, we have Aedan Butlet from the Naval Historical Branch, just across the way here on the dockyard. He's one of the senior researchers, and he's going to talk to us about the Rhine crossing in 1945. So, without further ado, over to you, Aedan. Do you want to use the mic?
Yeah, I will do actually, because usually mumbling in my time. Right. Yeah, so as I said, George has brought me in as an 11th hour replacement. Apologies if this ends up being rather disastrous. If this ends up being like the Ashes, who are allowed to, be equally as upset. I don't follow cricket, but I understand something. So I'm looking at the Royal Navy on the Rhine, and while the Royal Marines will enter into this picture, please do not be offended if they don't enter as much as you're hoping. They do, however, feature as because wherever the Royal Navy goes, the Royal Marines are ever present, and usually, as can be seen, acquiring some lovely German furniture in the process. But that comes slightly later. So the kind of impetus behind this talk was reading this passage, which was produced by the Naval Historical Branch sometime in the 1950s. This is the beginning of a very short write, the kind of thing the branch was doing at the time to sort of answer public questions, but also parliamentary questions and things about goings on. And it begins with at 3:30 on the 24th of March, the first landing craft goes into the Rhine. So from there, I thought, well, why is it there? Who's got it there? And is its purpose going to be executed as intended? Because on the one hand, if you read accounts of the Rhine crossing, the landing craft and the sort of role of getting them there does often get mentioned, but usually in passing. Recent books, for example, have mentioned the number of craft got there and the fact that they're transported in a certain way, but they then sort of don't explain why they're there. So I thought, well, someone would best have a dig around. And actually, from the historical documentation, as you'll see, the planning for why they're there is very numerous and very flexible. So this is, of course, not the first time that the Royal Navy has operated on the Rhine. When we arrived in 1945, these pictures are from 1919, the occupying forces after the end of the First World War. This is the crew of ML 229 in Cologne. Unfortunately, several of these chaps here will be killed because there is a detonation on board one of the craft soon after this picture is taken. It's an accidental detonation, and a couple of the chaps are killed. But they are there because there is to be an inspection by a senior French military higher-ups of occupying forces. So they've got their splendour on, of course. And it was a lot easier to get to the Rhine in 1919 because we could simply go by the canal. So this is an ML crossing one of the crossing via canal to get to the occupying positions along by Cologne. If you read the accounts, they're quite marvellous. Basically, they just sort of up and sail down the rivers of Europe. It sounds really rather lovely, to be honest. The Royal Navy remains until January 1926. So that is when the last naval presence of the occupying forces is removed. So they will be back 19 years later, and it must be said the journey will be far more arduous and involve far less lovely canal sailing. So we are not also the first people to bridge the Rhine. That honour apparently goes to Julius Caesar, which is always good when you can go right back to antiquity. And this is a really rather marvellous extract from an intelligence briefing which is given to the 51st Highland Division just before they go over. And what I love is that they record this translation from Latin of Caesar's crossing of the Rhine, and they note specifically it's an American translation, which I think might be a dig in case any of the Latin's wrong. I'm not entirely sure, but they do make very plain it's an American translation. And so, yes, it took Caesar 10 days to bridge the Rhine on his campaign into Gaul at the time. Interestingly, his first attempt was thwarted because he built the bridge 10 days, very impressive, using piles, and you can see replicas of them today if you go to the Rhine in Germany. He builds a bridge across, roughly as you would nowadays, really. And he gets across, and as it so transpires, the Gauls have seen what he's doing, because of course they have, he's building a shocking great bridge, have mobilised and presented quite a formidable military force. So he retreats over his own bridge and burns it down, which must have been brilliant for the engineers involved. However, he comes back a few weeks later, builds the whole thing again, and then achieves military success. But, it's quite a storied thing. So, it was rammed home to the Scots before they go over that they will be stepping in the footsteps of Caesar. But interestingly, they will be doing so by amphibians and by boats, and that was deemed unworthy of Caesar. The idea of him crossing in a boat, how unsensible of the great general. So yes, he refused flatly and said, "I must have a bridge for his legions." So, and that's what you get with sort of despotic leaders of armies, I suppose. But the planning for Operation Plunder the Allied crossing of the Rhine, begins in October of 1944. Why? Well, because the original plan for crossing the Rhine, Market Garden, doesn't go entirely to plan. Immediately we realised that the storming of the Rhine is going to be a lot more complicated affair than anticipated. However, the thinking about crossing the Rhine across a wide front begins much earlier, because, you know, Eisenhower is about wide front, putting all together. So the principle of, you know, one individual crossing, either at Arnhem or, as we'll see later, at Remagen by the Americans, that doesn't get you a lot. Yes, you've got a little foothold, but you need to be across en masse. So the planning for the crossing of the Rhine kind of, it gestates from there. But it's so in Plunder, as the form it will take when it is executed, begins planning in October. It is, however, delayed by the Battle of the Bulge. So the Battle of the Bulge shifts around the armies of Europe immensely. Everyone is out of kilter. All planning sort of goes vaguely out of the window as the US and British forces kind of contain German offensive. And then the fighting through the winter delays all the kind of getting things together. So the offensive to reach the Rhine, veritable for the British and Canadians and grenade for the Americans, is delayed until early 1945. This is a rather marvellous picture of some of the LBTs going along the banks towards the bridge in Nijmegen, which so the salient in Nijmegen, which we are able to secure as a result of Market Garden, is used as the springboard for the fighting through the Reichswald. So it was not an entirely wasted there. I think it's too easy to look at Market Garden as a total failure. The salient around Nijmegen, hard defended and hard fought for, it was brilliant springboard for what comes next, because you are close enough to the Rhine and have waterway connections that you can get supplies and men and material where they need to be. So Monty, as ever, sends out one of these rather marvellous messages to the 21st Army Group. And the language is not the language of sort of uncertainty. So, you know, there is no possibility of doubt. There's very words in there. And that victory is to be achieved. And that this is into the ring for the final time. He loved a sort of sporting analogy, sporting and hunting. So the state of the German army is, you know, it's in flight, it's destroyed, we're getting across, but also there is that sense that this is into the ring. This is not just a walkover, because just the art of getting over the Rhine, just the natural barrier in and of itself, is a complicated adversary. And also the Germans are by no means a spent force, because the casualties for veritable alone between the Canadians and British is 15,600 casualties in just under a month of fighting to reach the banks of the Rhine. And they are people we do not have to replace. You know, the manpower crisis is growing ever more apparent. That said, the Germans are in a much worse state, as they've lost 90,000 casualties across the same period. And it's interesting that Kesselring, when he inherits the forces defending the Rhine from Rundstedt, his assessment is, I have inherited a bankrupt estate. That is his assessment of his troops, which must have filled them with a degree of confidence. But as can be seen, the no room for doubt ethos of Monty is backed by extreme material superiority. So not only do we have, you know, tens of thousands of tons of material, tens of thousands of ammunition, 1,500 rounds per 25-pounder along the front, but also thousands of guns, over 3,000 guns, and that's of all calibers. So it is slightly cheating. That's including from the Bofors gun right up to a, you know, howitzer. But also 2,000 tanks is quite a commanding superiority. Compare these numbers of guns. So, for example, the 3,400 guns of all calibers. Any guesses how many guns of all calibers Monty had at Alamein? I'd be very impressed. There's 980 of all calibers. So, and that's considered one of the great barrages of, you know, sort of the war, and yet, you know, the number of guns here is simply staggering. Compare it to the Germans, it gets even better, because the Germans have 160 guns of all calibers across the whole front. So we are talking around 60 88s, which is, you know, by no means a little thing, and they have in the British sector a sum total of 35 tanks. So this is by no means going to be a pushover, but the material superiority we have weighed against the German forces on the opposite bank are quite staggering. Add to that the ability to call in the RAF as and when you need. So Wesel, where the Royal Marines go across, the night before, 195 Lancasters and 23 Mosquitoes come over, and 97% of the town is completely and totally annihilated for the loss of 0 aircraft. And again, add to that, if that wasn't simply enough, we have to construct a smoke screen to cover the guys crossing, which is 60 miles long. It's thought to be one of the longest smoke screens ever constructed for, an offensive of this kind. That involved 8,500 canisters of zinc chloride, which doesn't sound particularly healthy, but and 450,000 gallons of liquid fog, and took a combined total of 1,300 men to just set up the smoke screen. That's just to set that up. And what's interesting is when you read accounts from some of the chaps over the other side, there's a brilliant account from a Fallschirmjäger officer who was asked afterwards, what was it like when the Allies came over? And he says, well, I could neither see or hear anything, and then I was captured. So, that's an effective barrage plus smokescreen, I suspect, laid there. So, interestingly as well, this talk will not address the crossing of the US 9th Army, nor will it look at the airborne operation, because that's far too much to fill in, frankly. But Flashpoint, the US crossing, is kind of its own beast, contained. The British and Canadian crossings are conducted with a set amount of equipment and a set of other, whereas the 9th Army kind of goes its own way and has very much its own landing craft and its own way of carrying on. So to try and address that here would be to simply muddy the water. But yeah, so the three main British operations: Turn Screw, Widgeon, and Torchlight, which we'll be looking at. So moving on to that, so to kind of more touch on what the Americans are up to and why do we still have an American army under Monty's command. So the manpower shortage, as I mentioned, is acute. And interestingly, Eisenhower himself sets out that without the presence of US troops, the ability for the 21st Army Group to continue on the offensive is severely limited. So the presence of US troops is nothing else, it's to keep us moving and to keep us kind of going forward, because the squeeze on manpower is becoming ever more acute. But they use their own landing craft, conduct their own crossings. Patton famously gets over first. We will not be addressing Patton, he gets enough press as is. So, but in short, the US Navy conducts its own Rhine crossings, and they are using a far more traditional role. This is blokes in helmets, sort of going across in landing craft, disembarking. That's not quite how things will go in the British sector. So, why can't we simply use the bridges? Well, as might be obvious, but most of them are blown to smithereens. This is the road bridge at Wesel. And this is the other road bridge at Wesel. So we're not using either of those. Ignore the Bailey Bridge in the background. That's a spoiler for what's later to come, I suppose. But you can interestingly view two of the crossing points here. So that's Wesel, as seen before, and then Xanten above. And what's quite fascinating is you can see the Allied bomb damage on the side of the river. And then you can see the destruction of the bridge by the Germans in the middle. So it's kind of, we're sharing responsibility for damage in terms of civilian infrastructure on certainly a Wesel. And as you can also see, the bridging effort very quickly will fill that gap, but it's about securing the bank to build those bridges in the first place. So when the murmurings begin about needing the Royal Navy's presence, in January of 1945, Eisenhower puts out a shout to Pug Ismay, Churchill's chief of staff, and says, we may need specialised craft, which I love. It's as broad as it is long in terms of a phrase, specialised craft of all types for the crossing of the Rhine. And it is Ismay who says, well, in that case, I shall get hold of somebody from the Admiralty. So it's Ismay that brings in the Navy at that point. And his role, I think, from this in particular, is as a funnel for information to get to the right people. So immediately, Eisenhower says, we need things to go on water. Ismay says, irregardless of whether they need 10 or 10,000 landing craft, we need to get hold of someone at the Navy. So I kind of think of this piece of paper, these two pieces of paper, as kind of the starting gun for the Navy's involvement. So how many craft did the... So how many craft would be needed for the crossing? So that's a question that kind of occupies Allied thinkers for a short time. So in the initial, they want just a few. Then that becomes more than a few. Then that becomes, specifically, we want LCM3s for the crossing, and we need 72. So in the space of 3 days, we've gone from needing 10 to 72. So that's a logistical nightmare for somebody in the Admiralty. And then by the close of the 3rd of February, not only do they want 72, but they are being subdivided between LCM1s and LCM3s. So they've got squadrons, and they're going to be called 40. So in the space of 3 days, we go from wanting 10 to having a full force necessary to organise them. And we have a kind of breakdown of kind of the force structure. Now, that force structure is going to change. Though this kind of seems to be moving at breakneck pace, there is more breakneck pace to come. But and this, I'm preaching to the converted here, I realise on this, but this slideshow was put together for people who may not know the difference. So an LCM1 and an LCM3, the LCM1, the reason they're quite attracted to those is they're British designed and manufactured. We've got quite a lot of them post-Normandy. The LCM-3 is American designed and manufactured. We've also got some of those, but increasingly, as the war is coming to a close, the use of American equipment en masse is becoming more complicated. The Lend-Lease agreement, though brilliant and having supplied us with all the means by which we can keep going with tanks and planes and all variety of things, is beginning to start to show frames around the edges. For example, the use of US equipment by the British in Greece to suppress the communist risings in Greece has caused a great deal of friction between the Americans and the British. So already we're starting to look at a world where we're going to need to start making our own stuff again and making it in great quantities and using our own stuff. So there is a kind of murmuring about, well, how much American stuff do we want to use? As it so transpires, we end up using predominantly American kit for the Rhine crossing, but that's out of more than anything else, kind of practicality and what we've already got our hands on. So in all this, the Canadian Royal Engineers raised the point of, well, why don't we use LCVPs instead of LCMs? We've got loads of them. They're quite durable. They're more easy to transport by road, which is a bit of a spoiler for how these things actually get there. However, the books say they simply cannot carry the kind of heavy equipment that they are going to need to get across the river. So they cannot carry, for example, the sort of heavier trucks and the universal carriers and the kind of first wave armoured and soft-skin vehicles that they're going to need to get across. However, the Canadians just put the question forward and say, well, can we just break the rules and see whether they can carry them? And so the Admiralty goes around and starts to do some experimentation. And put it this way, so this discussion is going on in sort of mid to late January. Is by the 5th of February, we've already decided that we can break the rules. The LCVP is the way forwards. And we begin the process of working out how best to transport and slip them into the Rhine. So having determined by the 5th of February that Force U was going to be largely composed of LCVPs, 50-50 split in the end, the Admiralty begins experimenting with slipping them in from wooden carriages, cradles, from the back of tank transporters. This is a twofold decision based on the fact, firstly, we have an awful lot of tank transporters, both of our own and American manufacture, and also because the Americans have already done this. So the Americans transported landing craft by land for the unnecessary, in the end, as naval assault on Cezanne on the French coast. And they had done that slightly differently to how we did it. They parked trailers at low tide on beaches and let the landing craft float up onto the back of the trailers, which in the end probably knackered up the keels of the landing craft no end. But it was short term, it was a quick solution to a problem. They needed landing craft. No one had ever really done it before in terms of land transporting them. We were going to be slightly more precise. So we built wooden cradles, and this is how they were originally supposed to be launched, but we did also test whether you could use derrick cranes to just plonk them into the Rhine, which in the end is kind of what we did most of, to be honest. But so in the end, Force U, as is created on the 5th of February 1945, is the first squadrons, Jig, King, and Peter. And the reason that some of these are highlighted, as you can see from the key at the bottom, is that a lot of the craft used here are veterans of D-Day, the predominant number of them from the Canadian sector. And this shows the idea that these landing craft, if they go back to Britain, they're kind of all housed together. And it's a case of what have we got? What can we get out there? What's in good enough condition to be sent out to Europe? And these are kind of some of the ones that aren't too battered about. Although as you'll see from some of the pictures, the ramps and things show signs of a bit of light shunting over the years. But the coding that we use in our landing craft is a lot simpler than the Americans. The Americans seems to be completely indecipherable. It doesn't correspond to its actual number. So as you can see, you've got P for Peter, 823rd Flotilla, third boat. So you can see exactly which of them that is because they are assembled in numeric order. So in any picture, if you see one of these landing craft, you can track quite quickly which one it is. And that's true for the LCVPs and the LCMs. So so starting guns fired in early January, by the 5th of February, this is Force U, and this is what it will look like during the crossing. So we're a month out, and we've already got the force together. The man in charge of the force is Captain Percival James, who has the awful habit of having a first name as a last name and the last name as a first name, which I've said James Percival about 5,200 times to give him a version of this talk. And he's put in charge of Force U. His naval career begins, as most young chaps did, at Jutland. And he sort of had after that, he sort of was on destroyers and stuff. His interwar career was blighted rather by illness. And also, I seem to remember just a slight dose of infidelity, although I don't want to be quoted on that. So either way, his career does not go quite as well as he's hoped. He's in charge of a cruiser at the start of the Second World War, specifically HMS Cape Town. She's badly torpedoed by the Italians in the Red Sea. and at that point he's shifted to sort of more organising and training roles in Britain. So he's in the right place at the right time, basically. He's got enough experience. He's kind of senior enough. He's had experience leading large groups of chaps, and he's in the right time, right place, right time. So, and on top, atop him in terms of who's in charge, it would have been Bertrand Ramsay until January 1945 when he's killed in a plane crash. So he's replaced by Admiral Burrow. Burrow is one of these people who kind of rather gets overlooked in Ramsay's shadow. Ramsay somewhere gets too often overlooked, frankly. But he's again veteran of Jutland. He is the one of the Allied signatories to the unconditional surrender at Rheims on the 7th of May 1945. He's integral to the Allied war effort. But yes, he's a man who sometimes operates in Ramsay's shadow. But absolutely essential to the coming action. So to get landing craft where you need to get them on land, you need several forces kind of tertiary to the landing craft themselves. And these are MOLCABs, the most sort of well-known of them all, which is organising your base, where everyone's going to live, the conditions of kind of keeping the people going. You've got the MBMU, which is, again, maintaining the base, the LCRU, which is maintaining the landing craft, and then the crane party, which is rather self-explanatory. So they're the people operating and supplying the derrick cranes to get the landing craft where you need to get them. But so this is the shape that transporting the landing craft takes. They are assembled at HMS Sea Serpent, which is near Colchester. The craft are shipped to Ostend via LSD, landing ship dog, on the 23rd of February 1945. They are all in Antwerp by the 9th of March, ready to go. Except a single landing craft which is sent to Flushing in the Valkyrie for reasons that are beyond me. I've not really been able to work out why that one goes there, but it was evidently needed. The 822nd Flotilla is sent inland by the Albert Canal to train men of the 12th Corps, Second Army, on entering and exiting landing craft. They see no part in the actual crossing themselves. They are used purely for training exercises. This landing craft from Peter is being transported on an M19 US tank transporter. It's the same thing you'd use for carrying a Sherman or anything like that. So we've got plenty of them. And the wooden cradles the first of them was built in Vilvoorde, which is in Belgium. However, the rest of them were built on contract in Scotland and then shipped across Britain and then to Europe. And they are delayed in their manufacture, and that delay is part of the crossing because we decided to build them as far away as humanly possible from both the Channel and the Rhine. It must have been a competitive argument that the guys made at the Scottish firm. So from there, they are transported overland, moving mostly in the day. At night, they would stand still and they would camouflage the landing craft as though they are basically this bridging equipment. So about anything but landing craft, basically. The blokes are living in the craft as they're moving. Secrecy is absolutely paramount in all this. And it's one of the reasons that, as you'll see, the sailors are issued with battle dress. It's kind of a triple threat as to why the battle dress is issued. Firstly, it's for simplicity, for getting stuff to the guys. They're operating with the army. The equipment and stuff should be as cross-pollinated as possible. But also, it is for secrecy because they don't want the people to know the Navy are there. The problem being that they, as you'll see, they keep both their naval headgear and they put Royal Navy on all the battle dress. So I'd love to know who kind of... Anyway, it was 1945. I suppose we thought things were going quite well. But Force U establishes its headquarters, having moved all the way across the Channel in a Creek school, which is an infant school, in Nijmegen on the 20th of March. So we're 3 days out. And they've set up their headquarters, they're ready to go. The MOLCAB, the landing craft, they go into the Reichswald forest, which has been cleared during Operation Veritable. And it's there where there's some really marvellous pictures, you can see them on IWM in this, of Royal Marines giving people haircuts and things on the forest cover. It's really rather marvellous. They make their home away from home. They sort of erect a tent city under tree cover. And there's everything you could want for, really, in such conditions. But from there, the operation begins, as I say, sort of late on 23rd, morning of the 24th. This picture is from the official history of the 79th Armoured Division, and it kind of captures what I'm trying to get across in terms of how the Navy fits into this, because this is combined arms in one single photo. So you've got the land element, this is the bridging in the front, which is the focus of the photo, it must be said. You've got the airborne reinforcements going in to support varsity above, and then in the centre you see the sort of strange blob with an antennae sticking out of it almost. That is an LCVP being lowered in from the derrick crane. So this is one of the best images you can see of the actual process of getting the craft into the Rhine. So this must have been taken sometime around 3:30 on the 24th, because these are some of the first craft to go in. And what you can see there is just how much of the kind of toy chest we are throwing at this. You know, like I said, it's thousands of guns, thousands of tanks, and it's everything at our disposal. Even though the Germans, 35 tanks, that's brilliant, but they are still a determined adversary. And we're going to use every means at our disposal to get across. Now, not perhaps as many means as the people back home thought we were using. This is from the Sphere, specifically an article from the 21st of April, 1945. And not a lot of this is correct. So the motor launches operating on the Rhine, it's a brilliant idea, but I'm afraid they're 26 years late. The landing craft which are towing the bridge into position under fire with stuff on it are all LCPLs, which we weren't particularly using anymore. The only thing that is about half right, and I have to correct myself at this point, because in my original I'd made such hay out of it, is the Quad 50. Because although that is an American design, we were beginning to take them on strength from the Americans. And the reason I know this is because that gentleman there is my great-granddad, George. He was on the Bofors guns, protecting 30 Corps crossing on the Rhine. And although you can see there, they were using what are called Bofors SPs, self-propelled, they were also using Quad 50s. They literally just taken them on the week before the crossing. Not as many as they were hoping for, but there were British anti-aircraft defences guarding the river crossing. In fact, that there is one of the crossings, and you can see the Bofors gun going across. This is long after the shooting stopped, but they were doing so under heavy German mortar fire, which was being ranged in from buildings across the river. So it was by the threat posed by the enemy from the air and by artillery was no small thing. But as you can see, the Navy is already across anyway. Well, certainly the Royal Marines are. So by the time the Royal Navy gets the first landing craft in, a firm bridgehead has been secured across the Rhine. This is one of the brilliant parts of this piece from the NHB, because it is filled with such crippling post-war understatement that everything is just sort of, and then this happened, and then this happened. It's about a page long for the whole contribution, and leaves so many gaping gaps in what was actually done. But the Royal Marines are already having a good time, as I said, acquiring a little bit of German furniture, which I don't know whether they'll have asked for that. But the chap wearing the Pickelhaube, which I have to thank George for this one, is a Sergeant Murdoch, Royal Marine. And it's rather marvellous as well. They seem to have acquired some US cold weather boots, and I'd like to think they weren't issued as well. I'd like to think they were acquired. But one Royal Marine also makes sure the white ensign is flying over the other side of the Rhine. So this is from literally his local paper, this lad. I went looking in newspaper archives, and yes, Corporal Brudout, which is superb surname, from Dartford, got the first Royal Naval ensign across the Rhine. Unfortunately, I've not seen photographic evidence of where he hung the ensign. I should hope from the highest church spire still hanging around in Germany at that point. But the Navy is very much involved, even if the landing craft are not yet. But in reality, most of the crossings and most of the getting of men and materiel across, certainly in the immediate, it's conducted by the funnies of 79th Armoured Division. The slightly less funny, it must be said, LVT-4s and 2s, which are getting men and materiel across, but also DD tanks make a return. Not often kind of spoken of after the sort of failure of their usage, in part failure of their usage on D-Day, but much more suited to the Rhine. Except for this chap here. This is in the official report about the crossing, and bless, this guy is having his photo taken. He's one of 2 tanks which managed to get stuck during the whole thing, and they made sure to get a photo of him looking absolutely livid next to the tank and put it in the official report, which is rather good. I wonder whether he ever read it. I doubt it, but largely effective in getting sort of quick fire support over the Rhine to the guys there. And you'll notice that I think in this photo here, you can just about see it, that some of the LVT-4s were fitted with 20mm Polston guns to give a bit of forward support. Interestingly, reports from the crews of the LVT said they hated them. They didn't work right. And several of them accidentally dropped them into the Rhine as they went across because they couldn't be doing with them anymore, which I think is rather good. But yeah, it's interestingly, you may think, well, then why didn't the Americans use all this stuff? Because at the end of the day, all of the things you're seeing on here are of American design. That's to do with the speed that the Rhine is flowing. So where the British are crossing, the Rhine is flowing at around 2 knots, give or take. That is enough for an LVT to get across without swamping. And certainly it's enough for a DD. However, where the US are crossing further upriver, it's around 5 to 6 knots. So you can't get an LVT in there. You certainly can't use a DD. It would just flip over and swamp. So we're kind of using the stuff we've got. And also we've got hold of the stuff. We've been using it for things like, the catching of Valkeren, but also the crossing of the various dikes and rivers through sort of the northern Netherlands, we have this equipment on hand anyway. And the Americans aren't keen to ship it back to them, even if they would quite like to use it. So, yeah, we're using what we've got, and it's good stuff. But also, we're using quite a deal of these storm boats. This picture, I must say, is a bit of a cheat. This is from Italy during some training with the storm boats. But yeah, not the best. This horrible habit for if you jump in them overloaded with gear, as a soldier might often, they have a horrible habit of just tipping over and then drowning you with all your equipment on, which does happen, unfortunately, to a few in the early assault waves. But for the most part, they're quick and cheap, and you can get boats across fairly painlessly. But the big thing we need to secure a crossing is, of course, the Bailey Bridge. The securing of sites to build Bailey bridges is absolutely essential to the follow-up for plunder. And this is where the Royal Navy becomes absolutely crucial. But interestingly, so this is a set of Bailey Bridge sections which are being put together by some of the men and women on the home front. The Bailey bridges, when they're constructed in the factory, they are building basically one massive long bridge across the whole factory, and then to make sure everything lines up and everything fits together. And only when you've got to the last section do you know, right, everything fits, everything's square, and then that section is done and complete, and then that can be shipped out to the front. So we've got a whole production line of basically just building one massive bridge all day to try and make sure that everything lines up. But this picture here shows the assemblage of bridging equipment for just one area of the Rhine crossing. I suspect this is where 30 goes over at Xanten, but it could equally be another part of the British sector. And this is just bridging. So it shows the scale of it, and there's more of it still coming in. You can see the trucks bringing it in down the centre. And even the Americans were fans, because much as it pains the Americans to admit we've invented something rather good, they do set out that it can be put up just about as quickly as their stuff, which how lovely of them. And Jay Rhine from Butte, Montana agrees it's a lot better than what Germans have got, so that's good. Which must have pained the Americans to come up with such a backhanded compliment. But I rather like the Bailey Bridge, and I'm a little biased. Does anyone recognise this picture? And ignoring that I'm in it. Does anyone recognise that bridge? I'm good, because if you do, you've been too close to my house. So this Bailey Bridge is just down the road from where I grew up. It's class 40. It's a double strength Bailey Bridge, and it is to this day used by farm tractors and heavy goods carrying equipment to go across to the local farms. All of this is ex-staging area during the war, hence why the bridge is there. Yeah, it's still very much holding strong. And I'm also quite fond, as of course, Donald Bailey, the inventor, was from Rotherham. So it's always good to pick up someone from South Yorkshire. Never going to miss an opportunity to do that. But yeah, still standing to this day. They've replaced the boards about 5 or 6 times during my lifetime, but the rest of it is still going strong. So what are the Navy to do? So if the Buffalo are getting everyone across, the Royal Marines are busy nicking furniture already. What are the Navy actually to do? They're not just going to sit around. As this photo might suggest, I love this photo because this rams home this idea of secrecy being nonsense. And I've not just made that up. It's in an official report. They're issued with battle dress for secrecy. Not very secret. The petty officer in particular, I think, stands out. But why are we there in the first place? And what are we up to? So this is the floodplain for the Rhine. It shows the extensive area that floods from the Rhine. And the reason the Rhine floods is because the waters come off the mountains of Switzerland and sort of flood its banks. Does anyone want to hazard a guess when the Rhine floods? It's in March, when we wanted to cross. So we were anticipating that this whole area could have been inundated with floodwaters. This specifically, so all the crosshatched area, that is the crossing point for 30. So all of their area could have been completely inundated. And we are completely aware of this. And so the landing craft are brought in, if nothing else, to operate as landing craft, just as a seaborne, at that point, very much waterborne, way of carrying around men and equipment if things become completely inundated. They've also been trialling several projects, this one rather ominously called Project 330, which is about shoving bits and pieces of bridge, both as ferries and also pushing bridge sections into position on the Rhine. That they quite like, and the LCVPs are very good at it. So this is something that they will come back to in force, as will the ferrying element, although equally that ends up being done by LVTs and ducks and things like that. We've got so much other stuff that can actually do it. So by the time the landing craft get into the Rhine, as the bank on the other side is beginning to be secured, we are already building sections of bridge to use them as ferries. This is a section at a place called Emmerich, which is where the Canadians lead the bridging effort. That is from GIG Squadron, the landing craft there, the LCVP. and it is beginning to push a section, or it's securing a section while they work on it. It's difficult to see, ascertain exactly what it's up to, of Bailey Bridge, which goes across. And this is what the Royal Navy really turns its hand to. So, curiously, this picture is from 79th Armoured Divisions again, and they incorrectly say that the boat is from that this picture is taken at Zante and or Rees, depending on which caption you're in. It's definitely Emmerich, because that church is still there, now with a lovely spire, as is that rather large industrial area, and they've not taken chimneys down, so you can literally stand there right where that photo was taken and look straight across the Rhine. So it's definitely Emmerich. And the 823rd Flotilla of landing craft, that goes in at Rees, and that supports the crossing efforts of 30 Corps. The 821st are here supporting the Canadians, and this is not only is this an effort, a multinational effort in terms of the Canadian and British forces, but also the people leading the landing craft is a multinational effort. So the leader of the 821st Flotilla is a man by the name of Lieutenant D.R. Stevens, DSC. He's South African. He's a South African Naval Volunteer Reserve, and he gets his DSC at Dieppe. So he must have been rather thrilled that this was going a little better than this time, operating a landing craft. It was not completely free of hardship, the crossing. As I said, they were under consistent artillery fire and sniping. And there's a rather marvellous picture of General Dempsey taking cover in a rather large shell hole as a landing craft is being shunted into the Rhine behind him. And it's such a shame to see his lovely dress uniform. I think he was expecting rather a lovely photo, and he's instead in a shell hole while there's mortars flying all over the place. So yeah, you know, it's by no means safe when these landing craft are going in. So, to give an idea of the scale of bridging, this is for Torchlight and Widgeon, so this is where the Royal Marines are going over in part. You can see the different boom defences, you've got bridges, you've got ferries, and this is just one small section of the Rhine. And this forms part of the kind of, and the Navy forms part of this as well, so many different points of, if it fails, there is something else to fill the gap. So you've not just got 3 or 4 ferries, you've got 3 or 4 here, and then another 3 or 4 down there. And you've also got 2 or 3 different bridges, because if one is blown up, if one is threatened, there is always something to fill the gap. And you'll notice as well the boom defence, this is another thing the Admiralty are called in for. They are genuinely concerned about the threat of midget submarines and of German divers after what happened at Nijmegen with the divers successfully managing to damage the bridge. We don't want a repeat of that. So the boom defence is put across, and that's something they asked for quite early on, before the landing craft were even considered. They're after boom defence. This is at 30 Corps crossing point, and again we see just how many bridges we have rammed into so small an area. And you notice all the Royal Engineers are from London, because they start calling them Westminster and Waterloo and all this, that and the other. And coupled with that, just the sheer number of ferries, and again it's points of weakness that even if they go, that's fine, we've got something else. There's always a backstop. And how quickly these bridges start to go up is simply extraordinary. So it took Caesar 10 days. Not one of these bridges took longer than 3 days to build for the Royal Engineers. Blackfriars took 50 hours to build. It is considered one of the longest Bailey bridges ever built. It was 531 metres long, so over half a kilometre. That is 5 football pitches, or for anyone who doesn't do sports, 5 big bends end to end across a flowing river. In the space of 50 hours. And to do that, and to do it at speed, the landing craft are absolutely integral, because it allowed you to shunt bits of produced bridge. As you can see here, this is a sort of chunk of bridge, and they would shunt it out to the right and bolt it on, as opposed to building the Bailey Bridge, as you really are supposed to, which is to build it all and then sort of launch it into the river, rather like a boat in and of itself. It allowed us to kind of cheat a little bit. And what's rather lovely is all the engineers sort of put lovely signs on to mark their work. So that's Blackfriars Bridge. There's some chaps going over there. And that's Melville Bridge. So this is in the Canadian sector. And unlike us, we name them after bridges in London and things, they name them after the engineers in charge who built them. So that's why it's Melville. He must have been in charge at the time. And yeah, as you can see, all these bridges are just extraordinarily long for how short a time it is to take. So Melville Bridge is 32 hours, and it's nearly, again, half a kilometre long. In a flowing river under fire at parts. I mean, it's extraordinary levels of effort. And the threat is real. The German Kampfschwimmer are a genuine threat, and it is thought an attempt is made by the Germans. They have found it's one of the only times that the canal defence lights come in. I don't know if anyone's aware of it. Basically using older Lee tank hulls, and we bolt massive great spotlights to them. and then you can shine them. The idea was to kind of stop people, like swimming up canals and things like that. And it's thought that they do work, because I think I would shy off blowing the bridge if my retinas had just been fried out by basically what is the same power as the light you would get in a lighthouse, but being shone directly at you, which is quite extraordinary. But the threat posed by the submarines is beat by the Gardenia ASDIC sets. They're small sets that can be thrown over the side of landing craft. We equipped several of the landing craft with them initially. However, we do find some rather lovely German barges just down the Rhine, and we, shall we say, requisition them, and we just put the ASDIC off of those in the end and just have them stationary platforms to do anti-submarine detection. On top of that, the landing craft are used to patrol the Rhine. They are mounted with searchlights and loudhailers, and then the blokes on board are given from a selection of, not limited to, either a Bren gun, 3 Strict Lewis machine guns, a pair of rifles, and 5-pound depth charges to then go out and about and get rid of anything that looks rather suspicious. They also do mine clearance as well. There's 62 mines removed from the area around Xanten alone. So the Royal Navy is basically fighting a miniature battle of the Atlantic in just about the yay section of the River Rhine to try and get rid of every possible threat. It's not believed that the Germans actually mount a submarine threat in it, because I'm not sure how they've got the submarines there. One of the problems and one of the questions maybe asking yourself is, why didn't we sail the landing craft down the Rhine? Well, it's full of bridges, mostly. And it's full of bridges where the Germans might have tried to get them in as well. So it would have been a bit of a difficult affair. And the efforts of the Navy, in the end, are recognised. It is set out by the Allied commander how essential their efforts were. And I think it's just what really struck me in doing the research is how many different things they're doing and how well they are doing them. There are no, in the reporting, there is no instance where you see that anything being a complete clanger. Everything that is carried out ends up being at least semi-effective, and is often done on the quick, on the hoof, kind of, right, go and do that. We need someone to do this. We need patrolling. We need this, that, and the other. And it all proves absolutely integral to getting the bridges across and securing the crossing. But they are not quite done, because though Force U had been put together solely for plunder, there is yet one more river to cross and one more place to capture, and that place is Arnhem. Arnhem is still sat there, a sore thumb on the river, and the bridges into Arnhem at this point are all now being blown up, either by ourselves or by the Germans, particularly John Frost Bridge, the one there now, that had been blown up towards the very, very end of Market Garden. And the crucial element that we need to capture here that requires a landing craft is this little outcrop where the rivers meet there. And that's what we call the spit. The spit is because you can fire upon both rivers at the same time, it could disrupt both crossings simultaneously. And that's where you need the landing craft again. And interestingly, this time, they do get quite a bit of publicity. This is all taken from the Pathé footage at the time, loading up men for the 49th Polar Bears. And this time, the LCMs get a look in as well, because during plunder, the LCMs are launched, but they're not used. And here they are, because they've not been used, they are sailed down the Rhine, and they are as far as they can get, and they are used for loading heavy equipment across. So in the end, it's 45 landing craft take part in the Second Battle of Arnhem. Things do not go entirely perfectly, during the first crossing to capture the Spit, it's the Gloucester Regiment. So the Gloucester Regiment go across, and as is intended, they will cross in LCAs, so landing craft assaults, and they will secure a bridgehead, and then they will be backed up by LVTs. And the plan is to hide the LVTs behind the dike, blow the dike, and then move them through it to keep them out of the way from enemy shell fire. The only problem being that the Germans range a shell in and blow up the charges earlier than intended. This scatters the planning completely and delays the LVTs. So basically, the Gloucesters are a little stuck, and it is only down to the landing craft that they are able to keep men and materiel going across the Yssel to supply the assault on the Spit. And accompanying them is a beach commander by the name of Lieutenant Berry, RNVR, who is supposed to be landed and identify landing points for the landing craft. He, having got there, he takes one look and goes, there's no chance of me getting through this too easily. So he picks up a Sten gun and fights his way through the town with everyone else. Upon reaching the point where the landing craft need to go in, he successfully marks out where the crossing points will be, and that allows men and material to start moving into the town concertedly. Now, accompanying this, the LCVPs managed to move a whole constructed Bailey Bridge section down the Rhine to a crossing point, so that basically Allied armour can cross right across the Yssel into the heart of Arnhem. And it is done so secretly and so successfully that the first the Germans know of it is when there are fireflies sat in the middle of Arnhem waiting for them. And it's an extraordinary effort to move this whole bridge section completely in the darkness down the Rhine, ready for the offensive. So it's kind of, they're the Swiss Army knife of this whole story. They give you that ability to kind of flexibility to go where you need to go, get things where you need to get them, and do so quite secretly because they're only small and they leave quite a small footprint in terms of when they're moving. Total British casualties between the two operations. So this is combining both Arnhem and Plunder, are around 4,000. As ever, there's always a little bit of flex in these things. The Germans, it gets even more flexible. The exact numbers are nigh on impossible to track down, but it's at least 10,000 casualties in the space in the region of killed and captured and missing, and just sort of starting to fade into the woodwork, as it were. So, what the landing craft gave both crossings was the flexibility to ensure that casualties were low, things were getting across the river as quickly as they needed to, and they would have continued on. They would have continued on with the bridging effort, but the problem is that the Rhine was choked full of destroyed bridges, and it was deemed that keeping them on and ready to go would have not been an effective use of their time or the manpower, so they would have moved on again. So force use ceases to exist almost as soon as it's come into existence. The bridging over the Rhine, however, does take up speed, and this is into the post-war period. And what we build are just marvels of sort of civil military engineering and quite extraordinary Bailey fixtures to replace the smashed-up bridges before they are themselves replaced by permanent fixtures. And to kind of finish, the reason that I called the presentation that I was talking about the watch on the Rhine is the watch on the Rhine works both ways because it's a German idea. It goes right back to the birth of German nationalism, and the principle is that the Rhine is the great sort of barrier by which no one can defeat Germany because we've got the Rhine, and it's the symbol of kind of the German character. And they have a song called "Die Wacht am Rhein," and the lyrics are typically kind of chilled out and straight to the point in German sense. It's the sacred frontier way for the Rhine, and the lands around it are rich in the hero's blood, which is cheery and catchy. But they also added an extra verse during the First World War saying that Hail Wilhelm and down with that brood. And I think we were that. So, that worked out well for them, I guess. But the reason I picked out this Allied equivalent is because it is said, and I have not cross-referenced this, but in one biography of Churchill, it is said that to announce the capture of Kleve following the Reichswald offensive, he walked in during the Potsdam conference to a rather unwell Roosevelt and a bullish Stalin singing "We Wound Up the Watch on the Rhine," which is an old First World War ditty. And as you can see from the lyrics there, how apocryphal that in 1917, when this version was written, they were singing about Potsdam and they were singing about Rheims, which is, of course, where the German surrender was. Complete coincidence. I think just an attempt at a hacky rhyme. But yes, so the watch on the Rhine was wound up. It's too many R's W's, but rather effectively by the Royal Navy and the Royal Marines. And I'll finish on this rather marvellous picture, which shows that we can do sorts of patriotic images as well. The one on the left is a perfectly unstaged picture from the US crossings at Bob Hard. That young chap there has got the most American of names, motor machinist's mate Robert Moody. And the chap on the right is Captain E.S. Hall, Royal Army Service Corps. The Royal Army Service Corps are the people who drove the trucks for the landing craft, so they are an integral part of this story, unsung still. And I love the sort of requisitioned wooden chair, the loud hailer, and then, of course, the perfectly placed ensign in the background. Again, totally not staged for the newspapers under any circumstances. So, yeah, well, thank you for listening to me waffle on, and if you've got any questions, please do share.
Any questions for Aedan?
There is excellent still now called Watch on the Rhine, which is actually later present.
Oh, right.
Overlooking the Rhine,
Yeah.
Different to the other side, whatever it is.
Mm-hmm.
Because it is very biochemical
Yeah.
company, but it's called Watch on the Rhine still. existing?
Well, I intend to, I've not got out to that part of the world yet, but I very much intend to because it's so beautiful. It's difficult. These pictures from the wartime period, because everything's churned up by tanks and bombing and all that. But now, particularly Emmerich, looks just absolutely gorgeous. So yeah, I'll find what's on the right and I'll indulge in some, hopefully some rather good germinations. But yeah.
Thank you very much.
Sorry for stepping in at the last minute. Can I just say, frankly, one of the things I really like about being a member of this society is that you find these little bits of history that you probably never ever heard about before, unless you were in some way personally involved. So thank you for contributing to that. And that's it. Last minute.
Well, I realised I got that as far away from Burnham as humanly possible. That was quite good. Yeah, next time if you need someone on Burnham, I shall try my best to get a little geographically close. But yeah, it was a pleasure. Thank you so much for
Can I?
yeah.